Well, it is finally happening. Ukraine will soon be getting substantial aid from the United States. $60.84 billion, in fact. And all it took was a sustained period of Russian advances and multiple power struggles within the US Congress to get it across the finish line. There is a ton of metal about to head east, and we will talk about that at length. But even in this moment, from an outsider's perspective, it is hard to dodge questions about the United States government being broken, given that this took at least a half a year longer than would make military sense. However, strange as it sounds, and for better or worse, the US government is mostly working as intended. That may give little comfort to Ukraine, which now stands to benefit greatly from the aid, after suffering immensely without it. And while it is easy to blame these guys for the delay, the deeper problem traces back all the way to this guy, or even this guy. Sound weird? Then just wait until we get to the part where this connects to TikTok, and logs of all things. Let me explain. Today, we will cover the basics of the bill that Congress finally got around to passing, paying close attention to what it actually does, and what it means in the short term for Ukraine. Then we will pivot to a retrospective on why it took so long to pass the legislation, starting with the fun features of the United States government that makes doing anything at all difficult. Why exactly such a seemingly broken system was set up in the first place. How a more recent innovation called the Hastert Rule has made things even worse. The extra problems that arose under Speaker Kevin McCarthy's tenure, and a practice known as logrolling that provided a key workaround, even if new Speaker Mike Johnson is taking a political risk in the process. But we begin with the basics of the bill itself. We are looking at $95 billion in total, though it is split three ways. The bulk of it, almost $61 billion, is funding for Ukraine. Another $26 billion goes toward Israel and the Gaza crisis, including $9 billion for Palestinian relief. And a shade over $8 billion heads to Taiwan to supplement defenses against China. Focusing on the Ukraine funds, it sounds on the surface like money will just be funneled to Kyiv. But what is really happening is that Washington is using the war as a way to subsidize reinvestment in the US military. The peace dividend that Americans have enjoyed following the end of the Cold War has left the United States ill-prepared to handle a Russia resurgent on the international stage. On this front, the bill does two things. First, it buys US weapons from the military's warehouses to send across the Atlantic. These will primarily come from aging systems and ammunition that the military wants to replace anyway. But, and this is the key, the gaps on the shelves create space for new metal to come in. For example, and remember this for later, part of the plan is to transfer M777 howitzers to Ukraine to make room for the more modern and tow-free HIMARS vehicles. Similarly, Ukraine will receive M113 armored personnel carriers, while the United States preps more armored multipurpose vehicles, or AMPVs, for itself. That connects to the second half, where the United States can invest in new infrastructure to build more weapons and ammunition more generally. This part is why US partners in Asia have supported the bill for months. Yes, that infrastructure improves Ukraine's chances now. However, it would also improve Taiwan's, or Japan's, or South Korea's chances versus China in a future war. The two components thus have very different time horizons. Indeed, it will take Ukraine a long while to see the benefits of the latter infrastructure improvements. However, weapons shipments will have a more immediate effect, within days to weeks. You see, at the risk of ruining all future military intelligence jokes, the Pentagon is not oblivious to the political world around it. Department of Defense officials knew that the bill was about to pass, and so they have been preemptively preparing shipments. For example, remember that photo of the M777 from earlier? Coincidentally, it was taken on April 14th. Coincidentally, it is actually a photo of maintenance being done on the system. Coincidentally, they just so happen to be in Poland. And, would you look at that? Coincidentally, Poland borders Ukraine. Still, Russia also knows that this is about to happen. Consequently, there is a window of opportunity for the Kremlin to exploit. That is, Russian troops are better off taking marginal risks now than come June. Thus, it might get worse for Ukraine before it gets better. Artillery remains the central topic of discussion, as the current imbalance is a primary driver of Russia's slow but progressive territorial gains over the last few months. One of the key provisions within the bill is to increase U.S. infrastructure to produce 1,155mm shells per year by the end of 2025. Another component is to increase production of Patriot missile systems by 20%. The most intriguing possibility, though, is the delivery of ATACMS. Those are the long-range missiles that are compatible with the HIMARS launch system. An abundance of ATACMS, or ATACMS if you prefer, would allow Ukraine to put substantial pressure on Russia's air assets, which were pivotal in plugging holes in the front lines when Ukraine was attempting its counter-offensive last summer. It is also going to draw a lot of extra eyes toward the Crimean Bridge, which connects Crimea to internationally recognized Russia. However, the optimal time for such an attack has passed. Russia has invested in infrastructure along the land bridge to supplement resupply to the peninsula. Then again, that is a problem that yet more ATACMS can solve. So, in summary, something now and something later. With all of those apparent positives for the United States, one wonders why it took so long for the bill to pass. And to answer that, sadly, we're going to have to pull out our pocket constitutions. Now, that said, this is a bit of fresh air for our channel. International relations would be a lot easier if it were like Risk, where you could just consult the rulebook to understand the structure of the game that's being played by the actors. But in the real world, we both do not know the rules, and we are stuck trying to figure out how to best play the game without that knowledge. In contrast, there are explicit laws on how a bill becomes a law in the United States. You have a House of Representatives, a Senate, and the executive president. To pass any law, Ukraine funding included, you need a majority of representatives to approve it in the House, a majority of senators to approve it in the Senate, and then the president to sign it. Technically, you can have Congress collectively override the president with a 2/3 vote in both chambers. Trust me, it's there. The Constitution was just written in 1770s English. However, that basically never happens anymore, only once with Trump and once with Obama. Moreover, it was not applicable to Ukraine because Biden was supportive all along. So we are going to ignore it, at least until 2025. Hold that thought for a moment. Anyway, this may sound like a pretty basic set of majoritarian institutions, but it is not. The pivotal voter inside of each chamber is distinct, making it harder for a bill to pass generally, and putting Ukraine in a more difficult position. That is because seats in the House are allocated by population, and change each decade based on the census, whereas seats in the Senate are fixed at 2 per state. Using the 2020 presidential election as a frame of reference for the pivotal Senate vote, the 25th and 26th states in terms of support for Biden versus Trump were Georgia and North Carolina. Thus, in this greatly simplified illustration, liberals would need Georgia senators to support their bill, plus the senators of the 24 more liberal states, plus the vice president's tiebreaker, for it to get past the Senate. It is more complicated than that in practice because you have things like a Democrat from Montana and a Republican from Wisconsin, but you get the idea. In contrast, because House seats are allocated by population, the median representative is supposed to more closely align with the overall median voter within the United States, though that is not always the case. Indeed, the fact that each state must get at least one representative, and that having 435 representatives over 50 states leads to a ton of rounding. Thus, you get weird anomalies like the single representative in Delaware working for 994,000 people, while the single representative in Wyoming works for just 577,000 people. Side note, Wyoming actually has more representation in Congress, the aforementioned representative, and 2 senators, than sets of escalators, with 2. Then you also get distortions from gerrymandered districts. But the main point here is that these two are not the same, and we see that manifestation now, with Republicans controlling the House, but Democrats controlling the Senate. And then you have a president to get on board as well, whose electoral incentives are a weird amalgamation between the 2 chambers, thanks to the Electoral College, and randomly Washington, D.C. suddenly getting representation. This has led to a seemingly dysfunctional delay in sending aid to Ukraine. But the dysfunctional descriptor makes it sound like the institutions are not operating as intended, which is not exactly the case. Well, it also kind of is, but let's tackle that nuance. You see, the US government intentionally operates with a status quo bias. Thus, at some level, the reason it took so long for Ukraine to get aid is because of this guy, George III, King of Great Britain and Ireland from 1760 to 1820. The United States' government structure traces back to a bygone era. The American Revolution had just kicked the king to the curb, and the prevailing sentiment was that the concentration of power was a very dangerous thing. That helps explain why government power is split across so many institutions. But there was a broader skepticism regarding any political power. Thus, the solution was to create a status quo bias. You can change things. You just need a lot of consensus, for the Supreme Court not to kill it, and for it to not run afoul of the US Constitution unless you have an even larger consensus. It almost makes you feel bad for every foreign government's intelligence organization that is tasked with keeping track of all of this. Regardless, the writers of that Constitution, notably the future 4th President James Madison, were not really thinking about the status quo as being the absence of aid for Ukraine in a war with Russia. Heck, they probably were not thinking about Ukraine at all. At the time that the Constitution was written, Kyiv was part of Kiev Viceroyalty, which itself was a holding of the Russian Empire. Rather, the Constitution was written to prevent individuals from exercising Empress-like powers. But that is not the full story here. Biden wanted to sign an aid bill. The Senate passed an aid bill all the way back in February, and a clear majority of the House also long supported aid. So what took so long? Well, the extra bit of complication comes from something known as the Hastert Rule, which my phone originally autocorrected to Has Terrible Rule, which I love, and which might actually be better described as something that was done before and after Hastert, but is broken regularly enough so that calling it a rule is silly. This is named for Dennis Hastert, the Speaker of the House from 1999 to 2007. He also spent time in jail after retiring and being found guilty of things that I do not want to repeat here. So let's just take a mulligan on this whole thing and call it the majority of the majority rule, which is a much better descriptive anyway. The basic idea here is that the Speaker can use procedural agenda control to prevent legislation from reaching the floor, unless a majority of the majority party approves it. For example, take the current House division. It is hard to see, but Republicans currently have a narrow majority. According to the rule, you could have all 213 Democrats, along with 109 Republicans, support a bill. And that bill would never get to a vote because 109 Republicans were against it. It does not matter that those 109 are such a small minority overall. As long as they have the gavel, then they are the gatekeepers. And that is where the non-constitutionally planned dysfunction begins. Sorry, James. Welcome to the saga of the House Majority Leadership. This part of the story begins in November 2022 with midterm congressional elections. Entering that month, Democrats held majorities in both the House and the Senate. However, midterm elections in the United States generally work against the president's party. And that year, Biden's popularity had been sagging. Republicans therefore anticipated a massive swing in their favor. Instead, Democrats actually gained a Senate seat in Pennsylvania and only lost 9 seats in the House. Side note, I once found myself standing in line behind John Fetterman at a truck stop Sbarro. It is hard to miss the guy in a crowd. Anyway, the 9-seat loss was enough to give the Republicans a 222 to 213 majority. But it being a slim majority meant that the right wing of the party was pivotal in obtaining the necessary votes to elect a speaker. From January 3rd to January 6th, 14 ballots failed to produce a result. The Democrats united behind Hakeem Jeffries. Meanwhile, Kevin McCarthy consistently held a plurality of the Republican votes. However, on ballot after ballot after ballot, enough protested with the other candidates to deny anyone a majority. On the 15th ballot, McCarthy finally became Speaker. The gavel was his. Still, one of the concessions that he had to make to House Republicans was that a single member could force a vote for the Speaker to vacate. That would mean McCarthy would lose his gavel, and that poor guy really liked that gavel. In turn, McCarthy faced a significant problem if he were to put forth legislation that came anywhere close to breaking the Hastert Rule. It was an open invitation for any of them to file the motion. This theoretical issue was about to become a practical problem on September 30th, 2023. The US government was about to shut down without a new spending bill. McCarthy did not believe that a shutdown was a good idea, and so he worked on a bill to keep the government financially afloat. It passed, but with 209 Democrats and only 126 Republicans voting for it. McCarthy said afterward that if someone wanted to remove him because he wanted to be the adult in the room, that they should go ahead and try. And try they did. Technically, those 126 were still a majority of the 221 Republicans in the House, but it was still enough for Matt Gaetz to push forward on a vote to vacate. In total, 8 Republicans joined 208 Democrats to cast aside McCarthy. This led to another mess of votes between October 17th and the 20th, where Republicans again split their votes before ultimately agreeing on Mike Johnson becoming Speaker 5 days later. Around this time, it was becoming clear that Ukraine's 2023 offensive would fail to make much progress. And further, without additional support, that was unlikely to change in the long run. Russia had resolved its issues from earlier in the war. Washington needed to do more if it wanted Russia to stop taking territory, never mind for Ukraine to have any chance of recovering what it lost. The expectation at the time was that something known as log rolling would be the solution to the congressional gridlock. On the surface, it appeared that Mike Johnson was amenable to aid, but he also faced the constraint of losing his job, just as had happened with McCarthy. The workaround to the problem seemed to be to combine separate policies into a single bill, to make it more palatable to a larger group. It is called log rolling as a throwback to frontier society. You see, rolling giant logs is difficult, or at least so I gathered from browsing the DoD photo archives. Endless photos of soldiers struggling with them. Anyway, back in the day, you would recruit your neighbors to help you with the task. Now, your neighbors might not have been enthusiastic about contributing, but later they could oblige you to do the same for them when the time came. Legendary frontiersman turned Alamo casualty turned smallest tactical nuclear weapon namesake turned statesman Davy Crockett, who was the first person to apply the term to legislative votes. Regarding Ukraine, the first attempt to roll some logs went literally south and focused on border reform with Mexico. And then it went figuratively south. Trump killed any movement on the topic, hoping to set the policy himself should he win the 2024 presidential election. Instead, the package turned into the Ukraine aid bill, plus the Israel aid bill, plus the Taiwan aid bill, plus a catch-all bill, which, among other things, included an updated version on the forced sale of TikTok that we have previously covered, tightened sanctions with Iran, and the first step in a longer process to seize Western-held Russian assets. At first, the three aid bills were put up individually, and the extraneous bill constituted a fourth vote overall. This was part of the Logrolling compromise, so representatives could say that they specifically voted no on some of the provisions. However, ultimately all of them were bundled together and then sent to the Senate, which forced the Senate to address the TikTok sale after having ignored it in March. There, the Senate approved the bill. You know, as I've been recording this, I've had C-SPAN on in the background waiting for the vote to actually happen, and it hasn't happened yet. All I've seen is Lindsey Graham talking for a very long period of time. So you know what? I'm just going to put this down and come back to it. Maybe play some Zelda. See you in a minute. Ganon's not going to kill himself. Okay, it is 9:30 p.m. in Washington, D.C., and I can finally update this. The vote ended up 78-19. Yes, that's right, we are updating this live. Moving on with our lives. The reason that I needed to wait for an exact count was to confirm that both chambers passed the bill with a 2/3 majority, meaning that the existing Congress could override a veto if, say, someone else were president. Now, obviously, these allocations would change if Trump became president, just something to keep in mind. But that still leaves us with the question of why this all took until April 2024. Part of this is Johnson's recognition that something had to be done. Basically, it was becoming increasingly clear that Ukraine was going to continue losing territory without US assistance. In other words, Russia's success has risked causing its own failure, an issue that we have foreshadowed before. Another part of it for Johnson was how Iran's attack on Israel increased Republicans' incentives to log roll on their preferred issue, a topic that we had speculated on way back in October 2023. Side note, if you needed further evidence that Russia was not secretly pulling the strings behind Iran's attack, this is it. But the big hang-up for Johnson was the concern about maintaining his speaker's gavel. The key evolution was in a handful of Democrats' willingness to vote with Republicans to maintain Johnson's majority. Wait, Democrats and Republicans working together? What? Well, it's not as crazy as it sounds. Actually, in Alaska, moderate Republicans and Democrats routinely caucus together. And no, it is not because they have reached a point of frozen insanity. Rather, it is because the 8 moderate Republicans in the state Senate are insufficient for a majority, and they would rather make small concessions to the Democrats than work with the extreme Republicans. Thus, the Senate president is a Republican, even though the coalition is majority Democrat. Similarly here, that handful of Democrats can encourage Johnson to keep putting forth broadly popular legislation. Johnson might not be their ideal speaker, but he beats the chaos that might arise otherwise. The increasing recognition of Ukraine's troubled position, this time from the Democrats' perspective, may have further lit a fire there. Aside from that, the reason that Democrats were willing to do this with Johnson, but they were not with McCarthy, is because McCarthy had burned too many bridges with the Democrats previously. Johnson, by contrast, is more of a blank slate. Now, it is worth emphasizing that this may all change in the future, but in the moment, Johnson believed that support from the Democrats was sufficiently likely to justify the risk. As a result, the Ukraine aid bill finally made it to the floor, an emergency act 8 months or so later. It passed with all 210 Democrats' support, along with another 101 Republicans. As for the 112 Republicans who voted against it, well, they got rolled. But the bipartisan coalition won out. International praise came immediately. Wait, international praise? That sounds like a descriptor for my books on the war. Check below for more information on them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.